Welcome to our Israel-Palestine podcast, a project by graduating high school students from Berlin-Neukölln, home to Germany's largest Palestinian diaspora, and a second home to many young Israelis. Israel and Palestine are painfully present in our district and in our schools. We've spoken with historians, legal scholars, trauma researchers, and educators, some of whom are world-leading experts to better understand this ongoing conflict. Our approach has been multi-perspectival. We don't aim to resolve controversies or contradictions, but to hear different perspectives. Human rights and international law are the foundation of responsible multi-perspectivism. Can we learn to listen and hold conflicting truths at the same time? Find your own answers, or better, questions. Are you ready for the discomfort of learning? Welcome to a very special episode of our Israel-Palestine podcast. I'm Yusuf.
I'm Mert.
Today's episode is one we've both been looking forward to for a long time. This episode is special because our own podcast project is inspired by the book we will be talking about today. We're deeply honored and grateful to welcome a guest whose work has shaped how we think about history education in the context of deep and painful conflict. Professor Eyal Naveh is one of Israel's leading historians and educators. He has taught history and history education at the Kibbutzim College of Education and U.S. History at Tel Aviv University, where he had been the head of the Department of General History and was the chairperson of the General and Interdisciplinary Studies program. He is the co-director of the Peace Research Institute in the Middle East and has taught as a visiting professor at Harvard, U.S. Berkeley, Cornell, the University of Toronto, Venice International University, and the University of Vienna. He is one of the co-creators of the groundbreaking history textbook Side by Side, Parallel Histories of Israel-Palestine, edited together with the great Israeli traumatologist Bar-On and the Palestinian historian Sami Adwan. The book was developed in collaboration with Israeli and Palestinian educators.
Side by Side doesn't attempt to smooth over differences or create a single narrative. Instead, it presents Israeli and Palestinian perspectives side by side, actually one page next to the other. It's a courageous and sometimes uncomfortable book that invites students and adults to live with complexity rather than erase it, or even to hold conflicting truths at the same time. In today's conversation, we explore how the book came to be, how it's been used and received over time, what its future might look like in the wake of October 7th and Gaza, and how its core ideas might speak to other places like Berlin, where memory, trauma, and identity remain deeply entangled.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Professor Naveh. So, you've been a central figure in rethinking how history can be taught in conflicting regions. For listeners who may not know the book, what is Side by Side and what makes it so unusual?
Yeah, it is unusual because it is written in the midst of the conflict. Most of the history educator books that are usually produced in a post-conflict situation. When the war ended, and people often felt how we can change the perception of people in order to make the former enemy the future partner. There is a process of looking backward and try to change a little bit the narrative of history in order to change the image of the others from villain to partner. We did it in the middle of the conflict and not in the post-conflict situation. And in that sense, the context is different, totally different. Because the conflict did not stop, not when we started to think about the book. Although we had the illusion in the late 90s that based on the Oslo Accord, maybe we are moving toward a post-conflict situation with the Palestinians. But obviously, this illusion was broken starting in 2000, now reach a point of terrible outcome. So nevertheless, we have two choices, because when we somehow look at the project at the beginning, we already thought that the conflict will remain and continue to be a position either to live up or to give up, or to continue the kind of European style, create a multi-perspective narrative. These both options were totally unacceptable. When we did, in fact, we declared that we have a failure. If we continue in terms of European style, it's totally irrelevant to the situation because we are not in a post-conflict situation. We are not able even to look at the other as human being. So the only thing we have as a default is to try to think about two narratives standing next to each other, not able to talk with each other, able to create any dialogue with each other, but at least to put themselves next to each other on the same page. So people for the first time will acknowledge that the other one has maybe a different story. And this is the only unique outcome that came from our discussion, that we are not able to write a multi-perspective narrative in the midst of the violent conflict. The only thing that we can do is to then text next to a text. Try to be as honest as we can in order to give the other an honest presentation, so I cannot accept the other and the other cannot accept me.
When you look back now, what originally motivated you to co-write the book? Was there a personal or professional turning point that sparked the idea?
In fact, it's two. It's both personal and personal in terms of political orientation, because I'm kind of an activist that try to work hard in order to promote some sort of reconciliation between Israel and Palestinian. And I was quite hopeful that in order to continue with the Oslo Accord, you need to move from politics to the cultural and educational level. It's not enough to create diplomatic agreement if the society at large is still saturated with images and with hatred and with delegitimation of the other. And since for a long time, and unfortunately still, both sides pick the other as the embodiment of the villain and the embodiment of the devil, it's really hard to change. And I thought one step is to go into its education and style to try to make a different image of the other. And it had kind of a personal political orientation. In a professional way, I am very engaged in all kind of international attempt to rewrite history education in a post-conflict situation, like the German-French project, the Balkan project, the Chinese, Japanese, Korean project, the North Ireland project. There's a lot of interesting attempts all over the world to create, to move from a culture of war into a culture of peace, which is necessary if we want to create a different atmosphere between the form and right. And in that sense, both professional and personal/political motivation.
This book was written in deep collaboration with Palestinian educators. How did that partnership come about, and what were the first meetings like?
Well, deep collaboration is an illusion. It was not a deep collaboration. It was an attempt to ask some people if they are ready to sit together and to think together about a different project. So it was not any kind of an official endeavor. It was not an official, project. But on a personal level, I took 5 former students of mine. Most of them were engaged in teaching in Israeli school, and the same happened with the Palestinian. There was no kind of scientific and statistics and election of the participants. The participants were people who know each other. Well, the first meeting were a little suspicious. I mean, especially for the Palestinian who never encountered Israeli beyond the occupation, beyond soldier. They encounter Israeli only as occupier, as soldier, as people who make their lives miserable. For Israeli at that time, well, we thought that Palestinian as terrorists. Palestinian are the ultimate enemy, that we, at that time at least, we created a war to prevent any connection with them. And suddenly it's human being. And it was really difficult to choose the place because neither in Palestine nor in Israel was an official place that would open his place for us. So we find kind of a shabby hotel in his children there, private owned by a person who didn't want that everybody knows. It was kind of a clandestine approach. I mean, people secretly went over a weekend meeting, and just the beginning it didn't go quite well. Especially the Palestinian group dismantled. They didn't want to continue. It took time to recruit new people. For us, we start with 6 people, then we reduced to 4, then again 6. At the end, we were able to get some scholarship and fellowship from the European Union. So we broadened the scope for 14 teachers from both sides, and each group have an historian, another academic profession who have. That was not it. Our counterpart, the historian counterpart on the Palestinian side, for example, somehow left the project. It would continue. So I need to work with Sami Adwan, which is not an historian, he's an educator. And Bar-On is a psychologist, not an historian. So the whole situation was, in professional terms, was really difficult to carry out. But we did it at the end. I call the whole project successful failure. Because we succeed despite of the failure. Failure we'll discuss later. Impact. But at the end, it's a success because we have a book.
As a quick follow-up, could you share some insights on how the collaboration with Dan Bar-On was like?
Dan Bar-On, great. Dan Bar-On, the data. He died 15 years ago. He was known as a person, expert, social psychology, dealing with a former victim who simply need to meet each other. For example, he arranged a meeting from former sons and daughter of a Holocaust survivor on one side that will meet sons and daughter of the perpetrator of Nazi and meet together and think about the future. And then he moved to a Palestinian Israeli next generation of people who killed each other in 1948. So he had used this kind of activity enormously instrumental in his insight, especially when conflict was a real conflict up and almost endangered the whole project. He was able to go and to mediate and to think about it, to make some workshop on both sides. But unfortunately, he didn't have such a figure on the other side, create this kind of a disparity between the Israeli team and the Palestinian team. It did not help to the mutual understanding, because from the beginning, both teams were not even. But in terms of professional, not in terms of political position, obviously Israel is a sovereign state, Palestinian is under the occupation of Israel. So all these issues took place.
Was there immediate trust between the teams, or did it take time to develop a common language or at least a shared framework for this agreement?
Well, it took a time. And therefore, the whole project longer time. In the last year, started in 2000, and only 2007 we were able to produce the book. Normally it's too much. I mean, we didn't have a place to be, except in kind of a weekend that everybody talked with family that they are going to meet, not Palestinian, but other friends. I mean, but otherwise they were not allowed to go, because why should they meet with terrorists, and why they meet with occupiers? In order to even to create a meeting with them. Then when we somehow met together, the rule of the game was not clear at the beginning. What does it mean? Can I force the other side to change the narrative? Can you force me to change the narrative? So it took us time, at least 6-7 meetings, in order to formulate the rule of the game, how we are going to make it. And then we encountered the problem of language. None of the Israeli know Arabic, none of the Palestinian. So we decided to go to English, but most Palestinians did not know English. Some of them knew Hebrew because they were present in Israeli jails, so they know Hebrew. So Hebrew is the language of the perpetrator. You can't really use it. So we need to have some translator, professional translator who came and to help us, especially when we move from a booklet to a book, developed text. So at the beginning it was really difficult, but then you overcome it by using English and using professional translator from Arabic to Hebrew. But it was the second stage when we were invited by the European Union to make it more professional. But at the beginning it was quite difficult, because we didn't have a common language, and the common language was somehow people were passionate on Palestinian side, they were reluctant to use it, even if they know Hebrew. Unfortunately, most of the Israeli teachers came from the liberal left side of the Israeli spectrum, which none of them know Arabic. They know English, they know German, French, all kinds of European languages, but they didn't know.
The format, two narratives printed side by side, often contradicting each other, is very bold. Why did you choose this layout rather than trying to write a single shared account?
As I told you, it's impossible to write a single shared because we don't agree on anything. We don't agree even the fact. We don't agree even what are the facts that are meaningful to pick up in order to bring them to. So each one wrote his own narrative. It's the only way to acquaint the other with the other perspective, not to convince him, not to change his mind, even not to recognize. I think we have three stages when you want to create this kind of a common narrative. First stage is acquaintance. You acquaint yourself with the narrative of the other, not necessarily agree with it, but acquaint. Then you have recognition. Okay, the other one point. Maybe he is right. I point to a research. Maybe it's not right. I see to challenge it. So there is some of the beginning of a dialogue through recognition between the two narratives. And then later you have a dialogue, but you can integrate the two narratives into one. We didn't reach even the second stage. We had only reached the first stage, acquaintance. My truth, your truth. I don't accept your truth. You don't accept my truth. Therefore, you need to create the rule of the game very, very, very accurate. For example, we started everyone wrote it on our table on a second topic. Then we exchanged draft. Then the other one looked at it, the narrative of the other and was shocked. Then we put them together to discuss it. But I'm not allowed to change the narrative of the Palestinian. They are not allowed to change my narrative. The only thing that they can do is to convince me that I will change of my narrative. And I maybe try to convince them. Sometimes it perceives it, sometimes not, but I cannot impose my position on the other. They cannot impose their position on me. And therefore it remains very, very kind of separate. And also symbolically, we have this in the middle. We have a space in the middle that indicate that the two narratives are not able to integrate or to have a dialogue. And a good teacher maybe can fill the middle, the blank space in the middle with questions, with things that you are doing, with comments, with kind of a third approach with the two narratives.
Were there moments when one side insisted on including something that the other side found unacceptable? So how did you deal with that conflict in the editing process?
Okay. First there was the draft, the writing of the draft. For example, decided to a topic, 1948. In Israel, we call it independence. In Palestine, we call it Nakba. And even the same name for the topic, but we know we are talking about it. We're talking about the event in 1948, where Israel had a fight with Palestinian, and that was the Arab war, and won the war and got independence. On the other side, it was the great catastrophe of the Palestinian life because they lost their villages, they were expelled, 700 Palestinians were evacuated, they were forced to leave the country. So this is a great catastrophe. So it had the same issue. Everybody looked at that topic from his perspective and wrote a narrative. Then they exchange, and everybody looked at the other and was shocked. And then they started dialogue. All of them, they talk with each other. Two people who were in charge of 1948 on the Palestinian side, with two people who were in charge of 1948 on the Israeli side. They sat together, the both of them, and they discussed the draft. And after long time discussion, they could not force the other to change. The idea that it's not acceptable, because I don't have the right to accept or not to accept what the other say. So everyone should be acceptable because I'm not taking any responsibility of the other narrative, and they are not taking mine. Since the rule was so clear, you don't have the issue of unacceptable, but you have issue of terminology. Should you accept the persons? If you accept bad language, if you accept the right of to define the Palestinian freedom fighter as terrorist, or to define the Israeli as a villain, or a devil, or profane people who. So the idea is to avoid the offensive terminology, not to avoid the difficult content. The difficult content is there, but you avoid offensive terminology. And, for example, when the Palestinians totally ignore the Holocaust, the Israeli asked them, can you put it at least in one page if something happened? They didn't, but at the end, they did. They put a paragraph. We say, yes, the Jews suffered in Europe and we paid the price. But she didn't like it. Israeli didn't like it. But you see the perfect example of how everybody looked at the situation in a different way. Because the Palestinians say, German or Christian, he'll make double atrocity against Jews. And it creates a sense of guilt. And therefore, they support the Zionist movement against us. So Israel did not want to accept it, but they don't have a right to change it. You know what I mean? So in that sense, for example, each one defines the other as terrorists. So you have a mediator from Italy, you say, maybe you can erase totally the term terrorist and don't define the other as terrorists. Sometimes it works, sometimes it did not work. At the end, for example, the Palestinians didn't want to change it, the name terrorist from the Israeli fighter. Israeli accepted. They have no chance to say no or yes. While the Israel decided not to use in all time the Palestinian activities as terrorist activities. And they call it violent activity or aggressive activity, not necessarily use the term terrorist. So this was the case.
Was side by side ever officially used in Israeli or Palestinian classrooms? And if so, at what scale and under what conditions?
Officially, not. It is banned by both officials. The Minister of Education of Israel banned the books from the beginning, and I was invited to the Minister of Education for a hearing procedure, how dare I did such a thing. Since Israel is a democracy, so I did less. And I say, okay, you can invite what you want, I want to write it. You cannot, in Israel you have a procedure how you approve textbook, and this textbook was not approved and therefore was officially banned. Okay? Palestine is not a state. Palestine is an autonomy, and the whole process of censorship is completely different. People were feeling threatened by their neighbor or by the religious leader not to dare to use. So the process of banning was not official. The process of banning was simply to frighten the people not to do it. I cannot talk about Palestinian reaction because I'm not familiar with this kind of threats and fear and engagement of how you kind of, in an unofficial way, send things from being dispersed and carry out. I can tell you the whole picture from Israel. I know exactly that first the teacher used only one chapter of the draft, and all of them were called to the Minister of Education. And they have a letter if they continue to do it. the job is at risk. I'm an academic, didn't care because they cannot control my higher education certificate, like in most of the country. We're not obliged to have academic freedom, we're not obliged to be approved by a certain committee what we are producing. But as you say, even in Israel, connect prove. If it's not officially in the system, teacher cannot buy it, it cannot suggest it for matriculation exam or it's not there. I wrote another 8 textbook today that system that was not. This one was not yet. In a civic society, the book was very flourishing. And people bought it, despite the fact that it was banned. Maybe because of the fact that it was banned officially, it was a career for people to read. But it's all great to bad with it. So they did it in a kind of a non-formal educational form, like youth movement, like the NGO, like civic group of people, youngsters who sat together and read the book. Basically from the liberal left side of the country, Kibbutzim, places like Tel Aviv, not in places like settlement. And at the university, and at the College of Education, there we can use no one. But officially, education in Israel, the book is forbidden to be used, except in the last year, sometimes to circumvent this order by going into what they call non-formal approved education system that then people can use some private initiative that is not allowed, that is not need to get under the official approval system. So some schoolmaster, some head of school who wants to do it, can do it kind of in an unofficial, off record, without leading to any exam, but it will want for a general knowledge for people we can put. People can use it, but not in an official system.
Did you get some kind of response from the students and teachers that used it? Were there particularly moments that surprised you, or either of resistance or unexpected openness?
Yeah, the spectrum is very, very large. It's not either or. Usually on this spectrum, you can find at the extreme people who really mad at you, criticize you, who say that you are a traitor, you are giving voice to the enemy. But this was really real, statistically very few reactions like that. I got more reaction of acceptance with reservation, constructive criticism. Some of my professional colleagues say, well, it's very nice, but it's full of lies. How can you accept the Palestinian narrative? It's totally lie. Some other people say, well, I accept it, but you are not objective enough. In Europe, if you try to appease the Palestinian, why didn't you make a better stand? Some professionals say that there were a lot of factual mistakes because we are not experts in history. We are educators of some kind of professors. 1948, a professor of certain issues say, well, why not it? But saying all this overall, I got positive reaction. I got many positive reaction. Was invited to places all over the country to give lectures and to explore this issue and to talk with people what was the intention beyond the thing. And obviously, I got enormous, almost positive reaction from it. We received 6 peace prizes. We were invited to the United Nations. We were invited to the European Union. We got enormous amount of money from those Eckert Institute in Braunschweig to sit in Germany for every summer to complete the book. The book was translated to German, to English, to Italian, to French. In Cambodia, I get some chapter, and the Chinese to travel. I travel all over the country as a result of this project, even in places like Qatar, which I am not allowed the Israeli to go, but they gave me some permit in order to make a lecture in front of some Qatari educator. So things like that. Together with Sami Adwan, we called it together and we present. So it's a professional opportunity. But I started this project when I was already an associate professor. But since then, I continue to close my career and just focus on this book because it opens so many gates, so many international conferences, so many fellowships, so many reactionist politicians who was so enthusiastic, especially in Germany. They went out of their mind. Wait, how you do such a thing? Well, in Germany, they do it, but we cannot do it your way. Some of the criticism was like yours. Why you didn't use one narrative? What's the idea to put two hostile narratives next to each other? They can read it into different books while you put it on the same page. And I try to tell the book is the same narrative on the same page. Usually people will use, otherwise I will never take a Palestinian book and they will never take Israeli book. You need to put it on the same page with the language of the other, because you have it in Hebrew, in Arabic, in English, and later on in German, French. So this was the idea. So the reaction was ambiguous, but the outcome was very successful. Personally, worried about some other people might be different.
You already mentioned the reaction by your colleagues. How did historians in academia respond? Was there support, indifference, or a pushback?
Basically support. Criticism. Sometimes they criticize the content. They say you are not accurate here, you are not accurate there, or I did not use this book or my book or that book, because the level of the discourse is high school level, not academic level. Although we upgrade the level, change a booklet into a book. So there was some professional criticism, not political, especially not in Israel, because the academy is still an open-minded academy in the last year. The whole discourse around the book was in the first decade and second decade of the 2000, the first 2 decades of the 21st century. Now it's all silent, but we'll discuss it.
In recent years, we've seen growing political shift to the right on both sides. How did this shift affect how side-by-side was received and used? Did the space for this kind of work shrink over time?
Well, from the beginning, the book was not used by the mainstream. From the beginning, the book was used only by marginal books that were associated with the liberal left side of. They continued to. And even when the mainstream went to the right, politically it went to the right, but the Israelis, they are a divided society. There are a lot of different systems, and you simply continue to use the book. So basically, the book was used in Hebrew. Well, it's a second edition, it's a third edition. I cannot talk about the Palestinian. I know, I have the suspicion that it was not used at all. Because my friend Sami Adwan told me that I lost book in his room. No one wants to even think about I did books or use his books because it's people are afraid to use kind of a book. To see the enemy book in Arabic, it's well unheard. But in Israel, it was not shrink over time. It somehow subside. So every book, a few times, no one is going to go and to continue. Not the best selling. It's the book. But if I compare it to other books that I wrote and engaged, for me it was the most well spread book in so many languages, especially in the United States and England. I found 50,000 copies already sold side by side. So it's a great success in English, quite a good success in German. A failure in Israel and Palestine, where it should be directed to.
Since the Hamas attacks and the war in Gaza, how has your relationship with the Palestinian colleagues changed? Have you been in contact?
They deteriorated enormously. I have no contact with Sami Adwan whatsoever since the attack. I mean, this was a blow to any form of collaboration, and it will take time to resume it. At that point, and in my age, I have no incentive even to start to reconcile the bridge again. Although I know there's no other option, and at the end, both sides have to talk with each other. But at that point, probably I'm not in a position to encounter Palestinian colleagues, especially colleagues that justify the attack. And they are not in a position to encounter Israeli colleagues as Israeli, especially now when Israeli committed the war crime in Gaza. So I can criticize it as an Israeli, but Palestinian will say that they don't even want to talk with me, even if I criticize it because I'm part of the evil of the war. So therefore, unfortunately, on a personal level, we did not resume contact. The group did not meet again. I know there were some phone calls. People call each other. We don't have any colleague from Gaza. All the Palestinian colleagues are from the West Bank and Israel. I tell you the truth, maybe I'm not very proud about it. No, we don't have any contact since the last 2 years. The last 2 years, so many people in both sides created a sense of despair that it will have to overcome. Although on a logical level, I know there is no other choice. I mean, 7 million Palestinians, 7 million Israelis should somehow live with each other, and create some sort of coordinated solution of one state solution, two state solution, confederacy, whatever. But at the moment, I'm not in a position even to start to think about it.
In this very polarized and painful time, do you think projects like Side by Side are still possible, or has the political and emotional space for such dialogue disappeared at least for now?
The question I don't know how to answer. I think it's still possible. It will take time. I hope the extreme violence will somehow recede, somehow diminished over time, and people will start to cope with the trauma, because both societies are now in a traumatic position that allow them to look even at the other human being. Through time, and both society will realize that they cannot eradicate the very existence of the other society. New forces will emerge to think and to talk with each other. But the first thing will be to play football together, or to go to eat hummus together, not to talk about it. You know what I mean? Usually the stomach gets before our head, or the mashut. So I know that there are some things that people will play together, use people from Palestine, from Israel, we come together to play football. Great. As long as they don't talk history or politics. In order to talk politics and history, the other things, and it will be. Hopefully, like, there's no kind of political group, under the slogan that Jews and Arabs refuse the war, Jews and Arabs refuse the crime. So we are very much in it.
What has helped you personally to stay engaged with this kind of work during such a devastating and emotionally charged period?
Okay. First, I think it's a very challenging work. And we create some good relationship with the other, which encouraged me to continue. On a very egoistic level, I was able to publish articles and to increase my professional knowledge about education in an in-conflict situation versus post-conflict situation. I wrote not hundreds, or tens of articles all over the world in various languages about this project. So on a personal level, it helped me a lot. I became more famous than usual historian in the country based on this project. So there was some personal benefit. Yet, the risk of that, the risk, your reputation, especially the right-wing circle that you still want to have influence. And I can say that at a certain point I was quite stigmatized as a liberal left-wing person that cannot be invited to mainstream, even moderate right-wing circle. But it changed. Now I'm totally rehabilitated. Totally get rehabilitation by the Ministry of Education, and I am invited to give talks to teachers, to educators, to professors, even to officials in the Ministry of Education that are not so-called politically involved. The professional echelon of the ministry invites me almost every 2 months to give some professional lecture on Ministry of Education. Not necessarily by these two sides, side by side issue, but all kind of activities that I'm since then very engaged in promoting how to deal with difficult past, how to deal with shame and guilt, how to differentiate it between responsibility and guilt, how to be both a perpetrator and victim, like the Israeli, so many victims that became perpetrator, and how to deal with these two conflicting identities that not only the other put on yourself, but especially you think you are. Being a bystander, being, for example, the one who is against the war, but on the other hand, condemn the massacre, but don't think that revenge, the eradication of population is a result against the various attacks. So I collaborate with the Israeli attack. I'm against it. I'm a bystander. So these are issues that I was engaged in my professional research. And therefore, the project even contributed to make it more accurate, to make it more scientific, to make it more academic. So it helps. And somehow, I paid the price, certain price of being in this project, but on the other hand, they have benefits. So I don't know. It balances it here.
Germany, where so many Israelis and Palestinians live, and where Germany's historical responsibility is ever present, what would meaningful historical education look like?
Yeah, I think in Germany, you have the leisure and the luxus to be after the terrible event of World War II and to create a democratic state with all the problems. It's right wing, immigration, now mainly the democratic skeleton is still there. And you have a lot of activities that try to enhance and to strengthen democratic culture and to fight extremism, nationalism, extreme racism, all kinds of activities. So I found my project much more acceptable in places like Germany, like Netherlands, like Scandinavia, because they have the luxury to accept such things. They are not under attack, they are not under threat, they did not feel it the ultimate victim of the war. They got up beyond it. They create young people somehow, not all of them, many of them can accept the other and also engage with so many others that did not endanger them, but rather benefited them. Yet indeed, immigration, not all the immigrants are the avant-garde of democracy. Some of them got from a traditional society who are not leading to liberal democracy. I can say that such a book in this context can help a lot. And it's a successful part of my project is in places like England, France, Germany, Netherlands, Scandinavia, United States before Trump. Basically.
How can educators in Germany or Europe teach the history of this conflict in a way that acknowledges pain on both sides without flattening power asymmetries or silencing anyone?
I mean, since it is not you, but you took the other and you engage, to call it a process of estrangement. Sometimes it's much easier for me to deal with issues that are not totally related to my life. You take an issue that it's not in Germany, not in Europe, although there are some consequences of what happened in Europe and Germany in the beginning, in the mid of the 19th century that caused this issue. But you take an issue that is somehow remote, and you look at it as an academic issue. You look at it without the environment that I have, without the familiarity with victims, without the hatred toward the perpetrator, without occupation, you are not under occupation. And therefore, I think the first stage to use this book is to use this book in places that are already in a post-conflict situation. And I found it, and also judging from experience, I mean, the German were enthusiastic to translate the book to German. And then to invite us to all kind of conferences to talk with teachers, the same with others. It was less, I was surprised that I was invited to Qatar or to Morocco. Because most of the Arab world, they will not accept, will not invite. So especially in places like the West, this kind of project can be more acceptable. And the issue is, yes, should make a position. People are not objective. People came from a certain identity. And I think it's not that terrible when people will say, well, I support this argument and not the other argument. As long as they utilize some, let's say, honest reflection on both sides and then make the decision. People don't need to have one and ultimate opinion about these two narratives. By the way, these two narratives are really separate not only in content but in style, since the Palestinian narrative is based on people that are still under occupation. The tone of the Palestinian narrative is much more hostile, you can see that, victim-oriented, less accepted. For the Israelis, since they are the winning side, they reduce the tone of the narratives. Yes, they say, well, some people were expelled, some people defeated, some people, we have some guilt, because when acknowledge our guilt, it will not make Israel suddenly disappear. We are not afraid to acknowledge guilt because we're the strong side of the equation. So I think the melody of both narratives is totally different.
In 1977, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat became the first Arab leader to speak before the Israeli Knesset, an unprecedented act that paved the way for the historic peace treaty between Egypt and Israel signed 2 years later. That agreement remains one of the most significant milestones in the history of the broader Middle East conflict. In his Knesset address, Sadat spoke not only of borders and politics, but also of something deeper. He said, quote, "Yet there remains another wall. This wall constitutes a psychological barrier between us, a barrier of suspicion, a barrier of rejection, a barrier of fear of deception, a barrier of hallucinations around any action, deed, or decision, a barrier of cautious and erroneous interpretations of all and every event or statement. It is this psychological barrier which I described in official statements as representing 70% of the whole problem." Do you agree with that? And what does that mean for how history should be taught?
I basically agree with that. I do think that official agreement and diplomatic diplomatic signatures and a stage of military violence, but they cannot change the heart and mind of the people towards the other. The barrier, the psychological barrier, are still there, are based on images, on personal history, on myths, on stories, culture. And in order to move from a culture of conflict to a culture of reconciliation and peace, it's not enough to have official diplomatic agreement. Yet the great success of the Israeli-Egypt agreement that it was signed in 79 lasts till today, almost 50 years. There's no war between Israel and Egypt, and I can move to Egypt, and the Egyptian can come to Israel. Yet, why should I go to Egypt if they don't like it? Why do they go to Israel if Israel is still on a psychological level the enemy of the Egyptians? So, I was in Egypt, but on a professional trip. But I don't think that I feel home in Egypt. I feel that an Israeli still consider the enemy or the outsider, and we didn't overcome this psychological barrier. And despite the peace, which I celebrate every day, because Israel was the fierce enemy of Egypt, was the fierce enemy of Israel, and was the dangerous enemy of Israel. And now there's no animosity between two sides, but it's a cold peace. It's an official peace. We didn't overcome the hope of Sadat at the Knesset that we can overcome the psychological barrier and turn former enemy into present friends. We are not in the friend job situation. There's an exception. Some Israeli boy date the Egyptian girl, probably most familiar with Bentley. And it's not like German girls and French or Swiss people, Austrian people, or Italian. You are in a different situation because the animosity between Germany and France, or Italy and France, or Italy and Germany are now beyond political situation. They somehow erased and changed with the culture of commonality, of even solidarity, collaboration. And it will take time in a bit to reach this point.
As a follow-up to the quote, how does this psychological insight have to change how we teach history?
Well, it should be within a whole change in the education system, but which history is very central. We need to somehow to incorporate the other into our own system, to incorporate the Israeli history and Middle Eastern history and Palestinian history into one and multi-perspective narrative. We didn't reach this point yet, but this is the goal. As I told you, 3 stages. You need to have acquaintance, recognition, and dialogue. You cannot skip one. You cannot jump from animosity into dialogue. You need to reach the point of acquaintance, and you cannot reach recognition without it. Maybe we are now starting to acquaint ourselves with the other, to acknowledge that the other has a different story. And that's why we start with the idea of rehumanization of the other. Only when you reach a point of rehumanization of the other, you can talk to him as a human being, and then you start to recognize his pain, not necessarily to accept his pain, but to recognize it. And only later you can start to talk the dialogue. You start to dialogue with his pain, with your pain, and to change it into some sort of liberation. History is central, also civics, also all kind of human and kind of humanistic study, because we deal with human beings. But you need an atmosphere that supports such a project. In the midst of a war that is still there, this atmosphere is not there, not in Israel, not in Palestine, at that point.
What do you think education can actually do in a conflict like this? Can it truly shift mindsets, or does it mostly follow politics rather than shape it?
Well, it should try to get some autonomy from politics. It should create some civic society organization that will somehow work against the official goal of the Ministry of Education. Because the Ministry of Education have a political agenda, and when the political agenda is still so violent and unacceptable, you cannot do it through the system, because the system itself is the problem. The political system, when it controls education, it makes the education part of the problem and not part of the potential solution. And therefore, under democratic atmosphere, which I think Israel not a complete democracy, but it's still relatively for Jews a good place of democratic rights, as long as it enables us to create some NGOs and some civic society organizations, some private educational that can challenge the official tone of nationalistic education. I think education is an act of subversion, what intellectuals say. I do think that to a certain degree, yes, you need to challenge the concept of power through education. And in that sense, the book is doing its job, the book that we wrote, especially in Israel. How much it is the influence and what are the degree of the influence and how can it really stand against this huge power of politics and nationalism, patriotism, victimhood, and looking about ourselves as the victorious victim, the other as vanquished villain. These things are challenge. Therefore, I think education is a field that need to be explored much better and with much more energy.
Do you think it's possible that new generations can grow up holding conflicting truths at the same time?
I do think so. It depends on the education that this new generation takes. I mean, I think your generation, that it's open to all kind of social media messages, many of them conflicting messages, same that our generation was not even open to, because we have one narrative and this was the true and the other one. Since you grew up in an atmosphere that somehow acknowledge conflicting messages on a personal level, emotional level, family level, sometimes you need to follow daddy or to follow mommy. Sometimes you can follow both of them or not to follow each of them. And there is a much more open-minded, being more soft margin, especially in the world, the Western world, that enable you to digest conflicting statements and conflicting messages. And by being able to do it, you don't mean that you totally lose your identity. You can have identity which is more sophisticated and complicated. And therefore, I see some hope in the young generation that get their education in Western countries. Unfortunately, I don't see this hope in Israel or in Palestine, because in the Arab world, you see rise of fundamentalism, of religious fundamentalism, of jihadistic approach, which is terribly. And in Israel, you see rise, because of demography, of national, religious, messianic education, which is against this trend.
If you could leave one thought with teachers, students, and listeners about history, memory, and possibility of understanding across divides, what would it be?
Always look history from a critical perspective. Never be a victim of history, because history can somehow close your mind when you are a victim of history. But don't ignore history. And between victimhood of history or prisoner of history and totally indifferent to history and free from history, I say, look at history as a human endeavor, as a human experience, always with critical eye, always with critical reflection. The moment you are able to reflect critically upon historical events, you can create a much more mature and happy personality. So for me, history is critical dialogue with the past. Critical dialogue with the past. Not to be prison of the past and not to be afraid from the past. Always critical dialogue with the past.
This marks the end of our podcast. We are very thankful for your time and the insights you gave us from a historical perspective. Thank you very much, Professor Naveh.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to see you and to meet you. And I hope you can disperse it for other people to hear. Thank you a lot.
Thank you for listening. If this conversation was meaningful or unsettling, if it left you with answers or more questions, feel free to like, share, and subscribe. See you next time on our Israel-Palestine podcast.